Hi, my name is Bridget Diemer, and I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey and the 4th Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellow. I'm really excited about the Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellowship, firstly because ASLO has meant a lot to me during my career as an aquatic ecologist, and secondly because I think publishing and the editorial process is really a key piece of how scientific information develops. Writing, I think, is really central to this and has been something I've been interested in for a long time. I helped develop a co-led peer writing group in graduate school, and I'm excited to take this interest to L&O Letters in this editorial fellowship capacity. I'm really excited about how L&O Letters is offering creative ways of publishing work in different formats than is typical for most scientific journals. And I'm also really interested in exploring the idea of double-blind review as it pertains to the ASLO community and what some of the potential benefits and disadvantages would be of trying to implement an approach like this at the ASLO journals.
Hi, my name is Scott Hotaling, and I am a postdoc at Washington State University, and I'm currently also a Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellow as part of the Limnology and Oceanography Letters Journal. So I was interested in becoming an editorial fellow in the broader program because A, I really like to write, and B, I'm interested in becoming a journal editor someday. So the fellowship provided a really unique way to get that kind of experience at a very early career stage before that would actually be in the cards. And so within the publishing world, I'm really interested in writing productivity, especially as it relates to using limited amounts of time to still get a lot done. And so by working towards being more effective when I actually do sit down to write, I've learned that it makes the rest of my work-life balance a lot easier to maintain. So I'm really excited about the panel and interacting with all of you today.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelseypoulson, and I'm currently an assistant professor at Roosevelt University, which is a teaching-focused institution in Chicago, Illinois. I've been a Raelyn Cole Editorial Fellow since 2018, and in that time I've been involved in developing several workshops, such as this one, on publishing related topics for early career researchers. I've also been investigating what it's like to be an editor. So that includes learning about the roles of various editors in the publishing process, what challenges editors face, and what personal and professional advantages someone could gain from becoming an editor. By allowing me to see many aspects of how a journal functions, this fellowship has really given me a better grasp on the ins and outs of not only the peer review system, but also the relationships among scientific societies and their members specifically, society journals and their publishers.
Hi all, my name is Laura Falkenberg and I'm an assistant professor here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I was the initial fellow from 2017 to 2019 and initially became involved with the program because I wanted to better understand the world of academic publishing. Although I had published in the peer-reviewed literature and had been a peer reviewer, there was still so much I had been unable to experience firsthand. An additional draw was the opportunity to become more involved with ASLO and to strengthen my role within this community. During my time as a fellow, I became increasingly interested in how we can make scientific writing more accessible, both to scientists of other disciplines as well as to non-scientific audiences. Within this area, I continue to work to better my understanding of the skills required for accessible writing and also to transfer this understanding to other researchers, particularly those who are early in their careers.
I'm Dave Hambridge. I'm the editor-in-chief of Limnology and Oceanography. As an introduction of who I am, I've been asked to answer a few questions. The first is, what is my favorite thing about being an editor? Well, that's kind of easy, but I'm torn between two things. The first is I really get to read broadly, a lot more broadly than I would just from my research. And the second thing is I get to help authors. I think all of us enjoy that part, but helping authors to get their manuscript ready for publication, even if it's not with LNO. I'd like to see that even papers that we may not find appropriate for LNO do eventually see a home, and that we've somehow helped them make those papers better. Second, what are my goals for LNO and how do they fit in at ASLO? For that, I'm just going to defer to an article in the latest LNO Bulletin in which I was interviewed by Teresa Curto, our executive director. And then I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to just read from that interview. And that is, my primary goal is quite simple. I said to Teresa, to maintain the preeminence of LNO in basic and applied limnology and oceanography, a venue that supports and encourages global viewpoints, rigorous and defendable science, and the highest visibility for the broadest diversity of researchers possible. And I think that's a lot about what ASLO is about. The third question, what is something I like to do in my free time when not doing science? Well, believe it or not, I collect and play vintage, historical, and signature electric guitars. So there you have it. Dave Hambridge in a nutshell. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Zanopolis, and I'm the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Limnology and Oceanography. I have a few slides to share. So a little bit about myself. I am a full professor in the Department of Biology at Trent University. And I am also a Canada Research Chair nominee in Global Change of Aquatic Ecosystems. My research focuses on the effects of human activities on freshwater ecosystems. And I also do other activities in addition to editorial activities. I am part of several boards and panels. What I do as Deputy Editor of Limnology and Oceanography is primarily two things. I put together special collections that we call virtual issues, where we compile around a particular topic, high impact or high profile papers. But I also put together special issues for limnology and oceanography. Being editor is a very rewarding and important part of my professional life. I quite enjoy facilitating the communication of novel science and limnology and oceanography, while at the same time being challenged to continuously learn new concepts. I don't have a lot of free time, but when I do, I like to spend it with these three little guys over here, ranging in ages from 9 to 17. We quite enjoy traveling together and going on hikes and discovering new places. I very much look forward to this event, and I'm looking forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Adrian Sponberg. I am the Editor-in-Chief of the LNO Bulletin and also the ASLO Director of Communications and Science. For me, the thing I love most about ASLO is the community. So when the position of Editor-in-Chief for the Bulletin came open in 2007, I jumped at the chance to help our members share their stories. And the Bulletin is not your typical scientific journal. It's really where we go to learn about the people and the profession of the aquatic sciences. And that to me is one of the best things about editing the Bulletin. We have a lot of flexibility in how we publish information. We have different article types, such as articles, first-person viewpoints, meeting highlights, book reviews, and community news articles. And this variety really helps us convey information in the most appropriate format for the content. It also helps make the Bulletin more accessible to a broader variety of authors as well as readers. And the final point of accessibility I want to point out is that we do not have any publication fees, so remember that. The other thing that I really love about editing the Bulletin is working with our authors. Deputy Editor Chris Filstrup and I are very engaged as editors. We'll work with authors as much as they wish, from initial concept through the drafts, all the way through the publication process. And we do this both on an ad hoc basis, as well as through targeted calls for content, which are meant to bring more early career authors into the ASLO portfolio. Those programs, such as the Chapter 1 Challenge and the Journalist for a Day program, we work directly with the participants to generate an article based either off of the first chapter of their dissertation or a presentation at an ASLO conference. And finally, when I'm not working, you may find me here running a trail nearby, or most likely these days, especially doing the dozens of things that mothers do every day. I have a middle schooler and an elementary school child, so I'm homeschooling. Anyway, thanks for joining our conversation today. I'm looking forward to talking with you more.
Hi, I'm Chris Philstrup. I am an applied limnologist with the Natural Resources Research Institute at University of Minnesota Duluth. I am also the deputy editor of the Limnology and Oceanography Bulletin. What is a deputy editor? Well, that's a good question. When I was doing my postdoc, I really became curious about the publication process and the roles of responsibilities of an associate editor. And I really didn't know what those were other than my own experience interacting with associate editors during the publication process for my own papers. I was also really curious about the changing nature of the publishing landscape and how societies were having to adapt to that. So I remember seeing this call for a deputy editor position with the LNO Bulletin, and they encouraged early career scientists to apply, and I thought that was great. So I applied for the position. I was lucky enough to get it, and I think I've been the deputy editor for almost 6 years now, which is hard to believe. I've learned a ton during the process. I really enjoy the work. I think this is a really good example of ASLO investing in their early career members and helping them with their professional development. My favorite part of the position is really talking with ASLO members about ideas for stories and helping them develop those stories a little better. Whether or not it's an email from an early career researcher or student out of the blue, or it's a conversation I have at the hallways during an ASLO conference meeting. Those are some of my favorite conversations, and I really enjoy helping work through that process. So outside of ASLO, some of my favorite things to do, I enjoy brewing beer. I have 2 beers which are bottle conditioning right now. So hopefully I'll be enjoying those in a couple weeks. And so anyhow, nice to meet you. Thank you for attending.
Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Kemp. I'm editor-in-chief of Limnology and Oceanography Methods. This is the sister or child publication to LNO. We're currently on volume 18, publish about 700 to 900 pages per year, use a fairly traditional peer review process. Manuscript structure is quite different, and we have a different decision structure, which is probably worth talking about. And since this is a Meet the Editors panel, I thought it'd be worthwhile just mentioning a couple of things about talking with editors. And important thing to keep in mind is that editors are normal people. The ASLO editors in particular are not very scary. They're really quite approachable. So you can feel free, if we happen to meet at a ASLO conference, to ask me about things that have nothing to do with being an editor. I don't particularly identify as being an editor. Principally, it's not my identity. So you can ask me questions about my life. You can ask provocative questions that'll probably result in some good-natured exchanges. But you can also ask, of course, about LNO methods. And I suggest that you think of questions that are not about things like how much does it cost, or what's the page limit, or whatever. Ask thoughtful questions that would be interesting to talk about. Do you have an idea that you don't really know quite how to handle it? Are you maybe writing a manuscript about something that crosses between disciplines? How do you review that sort of thing? Or maybe your advisor or your committee is kind of pushing you to write a methods paper. Is that a good idea? Would you like career advice about editing and how it fits into a career? Happy to talk about that sort of thing. So I'm looking forward to this panel. Thank you for attending, and let's continue.
Hi, my name is Jim Cloran. I'm the editor of Limnology and Oceanography Letters. This is ASLO's newest journal. It is an all open access journal, and it's a journal that publishes short format articles. So if you have a thesis chapter or you're working on a project right now that could be packaged as a short format article, think about submitting to Limnology and Oceanography letters. Many of us who are connected right now are supposed to be expected to be in Madison, Wisconsin for the summer ASLO meeting. And of course, we're all disappointed not to be here face to face together. And the cancellation of the meeting is particularly disappointing for me because I'm an alum from the University of Wisconsin. I took limnology there. I think my passion for aquatic sciences began when I was an undergraduate there. So personally, I'm sorry to miss this opportunity for our homecoming on the Madison campus. One of the things that we do at ASLO meetings is have workshops where editors talk to graduate students and answer questions about writing and editing and publishing. We've lost that opportunity, but the Raelyn Cole Fellows had a great idea. Let's do this virtually as an experiment. So that's the origin of today's session. And I hope for you, two things come out of this session. One, you get to know us, the editors of the ASLO journals, a little bit and see that we're approachable and accessible. Don't hesitate to contact us. And the other is in the breakout sessions, we hope that you are fully engaged in the process. So don't hesitate to ask questions. That's the purpose of these breakout sessions. So thank you for joining, and let's go.
Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to meet the ASLO editors in the virtual space, especially because we can't do it in person this year. And I thought I'd just start off, we got a number of really great questions from the participants on the line today. And I wanted to just start out with a really general question about whether or not the editors are comfortable with early career folks, other folks that are interested in publishing in the ASLO journals, contacting them sort of generally about paper ideas and potential submissions. And why don't we start out with Jim?
Yeah, I'm actually curious to see the answers to this question from the other editors, but I think we're going to have a common response, and that is, yes, we want to hear from you. I think one of the things that's important for authors to understand is that there's two different kinds of questions that you might want to pose. So you might have questions about things like the submission process or the author guidelines, and those kinds of mechanical questions should be submitted to the editorial office of the journal. And the editorial office email address is listed on the homepage of every journal. If you have questions about content, about whether a paper that you're imagining fits in the editor's vision of the scope for a journal, that's the time to contact the editor-in-chief directly to begin a discussion. And I think it's really important for you to do that. If you have any doubts about whether your paper fits in the scope of the journal, don't hesitate to contact an editor and begin that dialogue.
Is there a time in the process when it's best? Is it never too early?
Never too early. I mean, in the formulation stage, I think when you're beginning to think about a paper, and you're thinking about a journal like one of the ASLO journals, and you're unsure about whether this concept is consistent with the scope of the journal, yeah, absolutely, early on. Send an email to the editor-in-chief.
All right, great. What about hearing from some other journals? Chris?
Yes, so this is actually one of my favorite parts of the jobs, is having authors reach out and seek advice on what they're proposing to write. And I especially like working with early career authors and students to help them formulate those ideas a little better. I think Jim is absolutely right. There's never a time that's too early to go ahead and seek advice. And the thing I've learned throughout the publication process is associate editors, editors-in-chiefs, they're really interested in hearing from you, and they like giving advice. So it's not an adversarial relationship. It's more like a symbiotic relationship. So.
All right, great. And what about hearing from Dave with LNO?
Well, I've just kind of agree with what we've heard from Jim and Chris. But one thing I'd add to it is what I really like about this forum in general, meeting the editors, is, and especially for early career researchers, we're just people. We don't bite. Well, most of us don't bite. But no, reach out anytime to discuss a paper, to discuss a concept, to discuss a review, discuss the process. I don't mind any contact because I want the authors out there, the potential authors, to know that we're here to help. That's our job. So please reach out.
Great. And I know one of the breakout session topics is specifically about methods papers. I think sometimes it can be challenging to know whether your paper is a paper for a method-specific journal or whether it's L&O. More generally, Paul, do you have thoughts on folks contacting you to try to figure that out or work through that?
Yeah. The least useful question a person could ask is does it fit within the scope of the journal? Because the answer is almost always yes. It's a very broad scope, and it's pretty hard to get outside the scope of all of limnology and oceanography. But what I really do like to do is to try to help people get published and find a way that what they're proposing to do would work. So if somebody were to write and say, not so much is this within the scope, but here's a one-page description of what I'd like to do, then I will respond by saying, I think this is an angle you might want to try. That would be very, it would appeal to our readers. We've had good response to that sort of thing. If I catch anything in what they tell me that looks problematic, let's say a small sample size or a very limited environmental array, you know, it was tested in one lake, that sort of thing, I'll tell them that think hard about that, because that's going to be someplace that reviewers will, they'll respond to that. So I'll give as much advice as I can come up with. People are usually pretty appreciative, so I guess I must be doing some kind of good advice. The other kind of contact is if the review's been going on a long time and you're just wondering what the heck is going on, because the online display doesn't tell you very much other than it's still in review. So I'm happy if people want to contact me, I will tell them exactly where it's at, how many reviews have come in, what we're waiting for, what day that's supposed to be delivered on, and so on. And that's perfectly fine. Do that anytime you want.
Great, thanks. Well, getting back to kind of this question about scope, we did have a specific question submitted that was asking sort of to elaborate on the scope of L&O, the L&O Bulletin versus L&O Letters. And so both of those journals sort of have less standard formats associated with the articles that can be submitted. I'm wondering if Adrian and Jim can kind of comment on you know, for someone who's wondering which outlet is better for their particular submission, kind of the differences and similarities between those two journal types. So maybe we start with Adrian.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to think like where the confusion may lie, and the point that I think may be a little confusing is that we do sometimes publish mini reviews in the bulletin. So I think in that case, the best thing would be to take that particular idea to the editors and just gauge. But other than that, I mean, I think with the bulletin, we're very much focused on the people and historical trends and events that are happening within the field, much more so than any one particular study. So that to me is where the division lies, but I'm curious to hear what Jim says here.
Limnology and Oceanography Letters publishes original research articles like L&O and L&O methods. I think more frequently we get asked the question, what's the distinction between L&O Letters and Limnology and Oceanography? And I talked a bit about that in in my introduction. And I think it's important for authors to understand this distinction. So LNO Letters publishes short format articles, 3,000 words or less. There's a requirement that the papers in LNO Letters be published open access. And there's an additional requirement that the underlying data that are analyzed in the paper be archived in a repository. So LNO Letters was a step that ASLO took towards fully open science. And so I think I kind of understand the question of what's the distinction between LNO and LNO Letters more than I understand the question about the distinction between the journals and the bulletin.
Great. Well, I guess the last question I have before sort of transferring the baton to Kelsey is about the actual process of peer reviewing. So someone wanted to know how did they become involved as a peer reviewer for the journal? And another kind of follow-up question to that is, do you need your PhD to be a peer reviewer, or do you just need subject matter expertise relevant to the article that you're reviewing? I guess, Jim, since you're on the you just spoke about this before. I don't know if you want to address this.
Okay, well, there are a couple of parts to this question. One is, am I qualified to be a reviewer? And this is probably one of those questions where there's variability across the editors in the answer to that question. From my perspective, if you have a history of publishing and reacting to the peer review process yourself as an author, I think that qualifies you to be a reviewer for a scientific journal. Another component of the question is, how do we learn to do this? How do we learn to be a peer reviewer? And in my generation, there were no resources to learn how to do this. We kind of learned on the job. It was probably very inefficient, but there are resources now for early career scientists to get guidance about how to provide effective peer reviews. There are a lot of them. And you can find them online. I know that Nature has a really good guide to peer review. So does PLOS One. AGU published a really nice guide to peer reviewers in its EOS newsletter, and you can find all of these online. There's another alternative that early career researchers have now, and it's through Publons. If you don't know about Publons, you might want to do a bit of research, Publons. They have an online academy, so do a search on the Publons Academy. And it's an online course for learning how to be a good peer reviewer. It's got 10 modules. Each module is about a 7 to 10 minute video that you watch. You answer some questions, you kind of are tested on the content. And then in the process, you select a mentor and you review 2 papers as part of the process. Then at the end of this, you get a certificate, you get a Publons Academy certificate. And in the process, you can specify a set of journals that you would like to be a peer reviewer for. And Publons will contact the editor of that journal, indicate that you've passed this course, that you've got this certificate. And for you, that's one of the ways that you can get training and begin the process of contributing as a peer reviewer.
That's really neat. I've heard of Publons before, but I didn't realize they had a structured program like that.
It was designed to give you the professional credit that you merit for being a peer reviewer. So it's an official archive of your peer reviewing history that you can put in your CV, should put in your CV, and they keep this accounting going for you. So Publons will actually compose for you a CV based not only on your publication record, but also on your peer reviewing record. So register for this.
Neat. Yeah, I know early in my graduate student career, my PhD advisor involved me in a couple of peer reviews, which was really helpful, but I know there's also confidentiality concerns where when you're contacted to review, it's supposed to only be, you as a single person looking at the document. What are your thoughts on that? Maybe we'll move to Maggie for that question. If you have any thoughts about, as an editor, would you want to be contacted and
yes,
ask for permission?
You have to, and I've seen that before, and I think it's a great introduction to peer reviewing to do it with your supervisor. I certainly, when the topic is really well suited for them, I ask permission of the editor. Can I review this with my graduate student? And so I leave that to the discretion of the editor to say yes or no. Some agree, some don't. But it is worth a try, but also for recognition, because if you're going to review something with your supervisor, it's nice for the editor to know we can add you then to the database of reviewers. And certainly if you want to review, we've been contacted by early career researchers in the past, and we can add them. We have a mechanism to add them to our review system. So to our Scholar One system, we can add you. If you want to review, just send us an email and we'll add you to the database, because finding you might be a little bit tricky right now, especially if you don't have a lot of publications. But that's another way where you can review, is to just, network and feel free to send an email saying I'm interested in reviewing, and we can add you to the database.
What about hearing from Chris on this? Do you have thoughts about how to become a peer reviewer? Good strategies for getting involved in the process and sort of learning how to do it well?
Yeah, I think the other thing that hasn't been said is just making sure you're reading a lot. So if you're reading a lot of literature from the different journals, perhaps it's the journal, those types of articles that you would be reviewing for a specific journal, that helps you learn about the writing structure itself. So if you haven't published as many papers, making sure that you get used to the different feels of those articles for different journals and how they're structured, that's really helpful. And also making sure that you're current on the literature, that's always helpful, especially for early career researchers and graduate students. They tend to be more current on the literature and knowledgeable than some of the older individuals out there who are maybe focusing on other aspects of science at the time. So I think it's actually really good to have a perspective from a graduate student, given if they're qualified in order to review. And just to echo the other comments, definitely reach out to the associate editors and editors-in-chiefs of different journals. If you run into them at a meeting, go ahead and chat with them and just let them know that you're interested in the process. And I think all of that's really helpful.
Great, thanks. Well, I think I'm going to pass this off to Kelsey. She has some additional questions that sort of focus on the publishing process in general and sort of follow up on thinking about peer review at the different ASLO journals.
So switching gears a little bit and talking a bit more about publishing and writing and how to be successful at those two things. What are some reasons, or the most common reasons, that authors get their manuscripts rejected? If you could distill it down to a few things that you've seen over and over again, what could you tell early career researcher to avoid? Dave.
Okay, well, I think Paul made a comment about it's really, really hard to fall outside the aims and scope of limnology, and oceanography being the better, increase our understanding in aquatic sciences. But you'd be surprised the number of papers that do fall outside the aims and scope. And I don't know if it's just kind of a shotgun blast of sending papers out to journals based on impact factor or something, but we have papers that just don't have a clue what limnology and oceanography are. So it's when it catches your eye. It's not all that common, but when it happens, you're wondering, what are they thinking? So the biggest reason for rejection, I think, that what we see is just a narrow focus, where it might be a really, really sound study, but it's kind of like, I came up with an artificial title of competition between a daphnid and a copepod in a tree hole in my backyard. And there are tons and tons of papers that come in that are really good studies, but they're just not characterized out in the broader context. They don't help us to understand aquatic sciences in general. It's very, very specific. It's not even couched within what might be the exceptions of that particular system relative to other systems. So it doesn't mean you can't do single system research. A lot of people do. I spent my career working on one lake in the Middle East for a long, long time, but you still want to think about your research. You want to couch your research, your hypotheses, and your study in a broader context. And then the one that's really hard to deal with and makes a difference in whether or not it even gets past me is just poor presentation. There are very specific ways to write papers. There's very specific information that you need to get across. So you want to have a good title that catches my eye and makes me want to read the abstract. You want to have a good abstract that makes me want to read the paper. You want to tell me what the background is. You want to tell me what the knowledge gap is. You want to tell me what your hypothesis is. What's your approach? What did you find and what does it mean? If you can't put those things in an abstract, it's really going to be hard to justify to read the rest of the paper. And right now, especially under COVID, the submission rate's off scale. And I got to think twice about asking an associate editor to take on another paper when they've got 10 in queue. Is this paper gonna make it through the systems, or is it clear enough? And so that poor writing, whether it's language skills, whether it's just rambling on like I'm doing right now, or just the failure to follow the author guidelines and provide specific parts of a manuscript that we want. Don't try to put 14 figures and 12 tables and put everything you've ever done in a particular project out there and just go on about every detail. Have a very specific paper, a very specific focus, a specific hypothesis or a series of hypotheses that you're testing. That'll make it so much easier, and it makes it an easy paper to read, and easy papers to read are easy to judge the science, and they just make a better impression on people, particularly in the reviewers and me. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a lot of helpful hints and helpful advice there. Jim, you wanted to say a few things about what you see as common causes for rejection.
Yeah, another one that seems to be fairly common is that the paper presents evidence that isn't sufficient to support the author's conclusions. And that can be a result of a number of things. The data are just too thin to support a big, broad set of conclusions. The analyses are incomplete, or they're weak, or the analyses are flawed. And the authors haven't seriously considered alternative interpretations of the data. So from my perspective, a common reason for not being able to make an accept decision is the evidence just isn't robust enough to support the author's conclusions.
Okay, great. Thank you for lots of good advice. At this point, I'm going to pass it off to Scott, who's the other fellow with us today, and he's going to ask some more questions related to writing and successful writing.
Thanks, Kelsey. So just to keep things moving, I'll jump to another question that is also related to manuscript rejections or publishing process. And I'll start with Paul. Are papers with negative results more likely to be rejected, and why?
Well, I've never had a paper with negative results be accepted, so. But limiting the answer really to methods papers, I have to give it's a two-part answer. One is reviewers do not like negative results. In fact, what they like is very strong evidence for an improvement over an existing alternative. I don't consider that to be necessary. I consider alternatives don't necessarily have to be better than. They may be better than in some context, but it's good to have a suite of tools, a whole toolkit that you could use to apply to a particular problem. You don't always have to get better than, okay? Now, if you want to prove that something is better than, you have to have a positive result. But if you want to prove that something is as good as, you might be looking for a negative result, a non-significant difference between two compared methods. And I'm just fine with that. I think that's a perfectly valid thing to do. So negative results are in fact not bad things.
So would you recommend reviewers not focus so strongly on positive results?
I don't instruct the reviewers to not notice that, to not pay attention to it. If reviewers come back with that kind of advice, then I filter it. I'll have a conversation with the associate editor if the associate editor took it more seriously than I think it merits. And usually that is not a killer for a manuscript. As long as the data are very solid, it's a definitely non-significant result. Absolutely.
Great. We'll jump to Maggie for any additional thoughts.
And I can answer this question from the perspective of an author who has published a paper in an ASLO journal, so LNO letters, with a negative result. And later, when the paper was when all was said and done and the paper was printed, at the time, the EIC, Pat Serrano, and I had a discussion about it. So this was a whole lake experiment where we added nanosilver to an entire lake, and we found no effect on the phytoplankton. And I mean, ethically, we have a responsibility to tell the world that there is no effect of this particular contaminant on the phytoplankton community so that people don't repeat the study. And doing a whole experiment is not an insignificant thing. It's a big experiment. And so I do think, to maybe say a little bit what Paul said, the negative results tend to be more scrutinized by reviewers and by editors, because we have to be sure that the experimental design was sound. And so they do tend to undergo greater scrutiny. And maybe this is one reason why we perceive that they're not published. But that said, you know, as an editor, I do notice that. We do have to be careful, and we do owe it ethically. We have this responsibility to also publish negative results. It's unfortunate that they're perceived to be of lesser value. I can see why they're less exciting. I can see that if you're an early career researcher and you spent your entire PhD on this one sound experiment and you get a negative result, that it's frustrating, but I wouldn't get discouraged.
So I'll move on to another question about the publishing process and preparing manuscripts. And this question I'll pose to Adrian. Do you have advice on formulating titles for papers? And what do you think is the most important part of the process?
Actually, I was going to turn that right back to Kelsey because she gave a great webinar for Lorex this fall, and she's the expert on this. So Kelsey.
Great. Kelsey.
Well, thanks. I wouldn't say that I'm an expert, but I will tell you that in terms of accessibility and searchability, that there seems to be some evidence that shorter titles that have keywords, somewhere between 2 and 4 keywords, and searchable phrases, so a phrase that you could pop out of the title and put into Google search bar or something like that, are really good for search engine optimization. So having your titles show up, having your paper show up if someone is trying to Google that topic. Placing your main concept at the beginning of the title, avoiding abbreviations, acronyms in your titles, and avoiding phrases like effect of or evidence of or involvement of, and just coming out and saying what happened in your study tend to lead to good titles. So, but I would love to hear anybody else's comments on that.
Jim.
I think titles are really important, and I think authors should put a lot of thought into titles, and the shorter the better. because you want to attract readers, and an interesting, intriguing title can be a strong attractor. I mean, I remember a paper because of its title. The title was The Aging Breath of the Amazon. I saw that title and I thought, I've got to read the abstract of this paper. This sounds really fascinating. So if you can do the equivalent of The Aging Breath of the Amazon on your papers, do it.
Cool. Thanks, Jim. And so to close out this session, we'll end on a question that I think is on a lot of early career researchers' minds, or at least maybe it should be, and they'll be very curious about the answers to it. But what do you, as the editors, wish you knew about the publishing process earlier in your career that you know now? And we'll start with Jim.
I honestly didn't know that this was my question. I'm going to pass for a minute.
Okay, we'll jump to Chris.
Yeah, I think in my mind, just knowing that the authors, for the authors, that the associate editors and the editors-in-chiefs actually want to hear from you. They want to talk to you. They don't get annoyed when you email them to discuss an idea. They like those conversations. So kind of this being rather more of a friendly process than an antagonistic process. I mean, I think as an early career researcher, sometimes we get a little more timid to share our ideas because we don't want people just blasting holes in them right away. And understanding that that's not really what the peer review process is about. Associate editors, editors-in-chiefs, and even myself as a reviewer, when I review a manuscript, I ultimately want to make it a better manuscript. There may be serious flaws that prevent it from being accepted right away, but I try to suggest what those flaws may be so that the authors can correct them and finish with a much better paper than they may have started with. So I think just thinking about the peer review process as more encouraging and friendly rather than adversarial is something I really wish I would have knew.
I agree with that sentiment as an early career person. As I've done this process of being an editorial fellow for ASLO and meeting all of you, I've learned a lot more about that. Everyone's on the same side. They want to see good science get published, especially in the journal that an editor is editing for. And so, but we'll move on to Dave. Do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Not really to add. I mean, I go back to my first answer to the question. The first question is, we're people. The editors are people, associate editors, reviewers, and knowing that early on, that as Chris said, it's not an adversarial competition between you and reviewers. They're really trying to help. But again, there are two things. Because we're people, because the authors are also people, there are mistakes. I don't think there's ever been a perfect paper. I've yet to see one, certainly not mine. But, take advantage of the system and what Chris and Scott have just said. The goal is to get the paper published. I've had rejected papers from L&O that went on to be published, and they were so much better because they went through the L&O review process. So do take advantage of reviews. They really do, despite, the criticism and maybe not being impressed with the paper or maybe point out flaws or weaknesses, turn those around, use them to your advantage, admit them, deal with them, and put your paper out. So, I agree with everything that's been said.
Cool. Thanks, Dave. Jim, we'll circle back to you if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, there's one thing, and that is when I was early in my career, I didn't have any idea the effort required to write a good paper. And the first 3 papers I submitted to L&O were rejected, and I didn't realize how high the ASLO bar was, and I realized that if I'm going to reach that bar, I'm going to have to up my game. And upping my game meant putting much more effort into a manuscript than I thought was required. And when I work with students and early career researchers, I tell them that if you don't thoroughly hate this manuscript right now, it's probably not ready to submit.
That's a good point. Paul, I think you have some thoughts.
I recall early in my career that I thought that editors were gatekeepers and that they were psychic, that they could foresee the future and they would reject things because they knew that this would not be cited. This was not interesting. And over time, I came to realize that nobody knows what's exciting. The L&O journals have very long citation half-lives. It takes a long time for a paper to emerge as having been really important. They're still being cited 20 years after they're published. So editors have to take chances on things and let the review process play out and not play favorites and not pick what they think is going to be a really exciting paper for the future. And I think ASLO does that. It takes a good number of chances. As long as the paper is sound, editors don't presume to predict the future, that this is going to be a great thing and we'll publish it for that reason. We'll let it play out and we'll see what happens. And that's a totally different way of thinking about what editors are for than what I remember thinking about it.
I think for me, the process that rejection is very normal, especially upon the first submission, was I had no idea that's how the publishing world worked. And so I was very devastated when my first paper rejected. And then my advisor was elated because it meant that there was an encouragement of resubmission and everything. And so the process to learn for sure.